I've got a couple of things I'd love to talk to you about when it comes to maintaining our longevity in ministry. But let me kick off with a story. I once stood on the edge of a bridge spanning between Zimbabwe and Zambia. It was an incredible scene, looking out at Victoria Falls and of the rushing water creating the Zambezi River beneath me. And I remember standing there looking down at this incredible scene and then launching myself from the bridge down into this incredibly deep chasm. It was 111 meters down to the water. It was around a 4-second free fall until the bungee pulled me back up to the bridge. It was an incredibly exhilarating moment, it really was. But soon after that, I started full-time in local church ministry. And honestly, local church ministry has its highs and its lows, but ultimately it's such an exhilarating experience to be able to lead a spiritual community where people come to know Jesus and their lives become awake to the kingdom of God, where you see lives being transformed, communities changing. For 26 years, I was honored to lead in the local church. And it's something that I will always treasure as one of the most wonderful opportunities of my life. But sadly, ministers in Australia on average last around 7 years in ministry. And there are around 10,000 trained ministers in Australia that are out of ministry completely. Why is it that many men and women don't make it over the long term when it comes to ministry? This was a question posed by Grant Bickerton, who researched this issue, sustainability in ministry. And he did a PhD in 2013 called Wellbeing in Ministry. And he did it through University of Western Sydney, and he interviewed around 1,000 ministers across different denominations to find out what factors kept pastors healthy over the long term. This is the conclusion to his PhD. Yet this study has identified that a specific category of resources, spiritual resources, are vital for the ongoing experience of positive motivation, energy, and significance in Christian work, though they appear to be naturally squeezed out by the urgency of too many important tasks that need to be done. It's these spiritual resources that are the antecedents of passionate Christian service over time. So how can we make sure that our spiritual resources, our life with God, continues to be life-giving over the long term? Because it seems that this is the key to being able to maintain a healthy, long-term ministry. How can we make sure that we don't allow our life with God to be, as Grant writes, squeezed out by the urgency of too many important tasks that need to be done? Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we create space for our spiritual resources, create space for our personal relationship with God to flourish. Richard Spencer wrote a fantastic book called Margins, and in it he says this: margin is the space between our load and our limits. Margin is the gap between rest and exhaustion, the space between breathing freely and suffocating. You see, we ignore margin at our peril. If we work at a pace where our load continues to increase until it's hitting our limits, and we allow no margin, then we will find that we just won't have the spiritual resources to sustain us for a long-term ministry. So the way to create margin is by establishing some clear boundaries. I wonder what boundaries you might need to create in life and ministry so that you can create some space, create some margin to allow you to invest in your spiritual resources so that you can sustain yourself for a healthy life and a life-giving life in ministry. We find Jesus often creating this space. Time and again through the Gospels, you see him going off to the other side of the lake or up a mountain, somewhere early in the morning where he invests time with his relationship with his Father. Mark 1:35, we read that very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, went off to a solitary place where he prayed. We find Jesus creating space because he knew how important it was to invest time in his relationship with the Father. And he actually comes back from that time with the ability to create other boundaries for ministry. In fact, it says some, his companions, went out looking for him. When they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone's looking for you." And Jesus replied, "Let's go somewhere else to the nearby villages so I can preach there also. That's why I have come." See, in creating that space for his relationship with God, he was able to also gain clarity around his calling, and he was able to come back and not need to fulfill the expectations of others, but create boundaries that would allow him to fulfill his calling. Sometimes we need to say no to the good in order to say yes to the better. And sometimes the better is creating space, creating the space that we need to nurture our life with God. You know, work used to be within the boundaries of time and space. There was a time when we used to go to work and come back from work, but you know, certainly over the decades, that's all shifted, even more so now in this pandemic. You know, not only did it start off with pages and mobile phones and then emails, and now working from home has become the new normal. And for those of us in ministry, sometimes we can feel like we're always at work. You know, Gordon T. Smith, in his book Courage and Calling, writes, "God is not impressed when we are overworked." And being overworked is a sure way to make sure that we're not going to sustain ourselves in ministry. We need to create space so that we can sow into our spiritual resources that, as Grant Bickerton says, is the one theme for those who have found well-being and longevity in ministry. We find a great illustration in Luke chapter 10. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and said, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me." "Martha, Martha," the Lord answered, "you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed. In fact, only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her." Can I invite us to choose that which is better? The one thing that we really need to sustain ourselves for a life of ministry. You know, Martha chose busyness and productivity, and there's a place for that. There's a place for us to be productive in ministry, as long as we also balance that with knowing when it's time to sit at the feet of Jesus and to receive. We need to know when to trade productivity for presence. Let's be wise by placing boundaries around our work so that we can create the margins that we need, that allow the space for us to invest in our spiritual resources, which will see us live into a ministry that is life-giving, to be able to stay in ministry over the long haul. You know, the church needs you. You are a precious gift to the kingdom of God. You know, these days I work with pastors all over Australia. With partners in ministry, I get to coach pastors, and it's one of the biggest sadnesses for me is when I see pastors not living wisely. And so I implore you to consider this really powerful research that Grant Bickerton did and look for ways in which we can create the space needed to curate our life with God. And in the next session, we'll look a little more about what it means to curate our life with God. But before we can do that, we first of all need to create the space, because if there's no space for it, how can we ever curate our life?